I'd just like to add my thanks to those of Susan for those extraordinary ambassadors of ours and everybody who's come together today to make such a positive difference by working together. And I'm really delighted to welcome to this fireside chat this morning the new Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips, and Nicole Jacobs, who is the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. We've got about 30 minutes together, so I'm going to turn to you first, Nicole, really to set the scene as to, in your view, if you could describe how you feel we are responding to the challenge of domestic abuse. So where are we now?
Well, I think it's mixed, isn't it? I often remind people, whether I were sitting with a group of employers or criminal justice colleagues or housing colleagues anywhere, let's remind ourselves where we are in our understanding about domestic abuse, full stop. We had our first refuges 50 years ago. Of course, there was a bit of activity before that, but really, by and large, most of our refuges 50 years ago run by, not created by the state or statutory services, created by feminists, women who got together and thought, we've got to do something about this. And kind of a word of mouth thing. It's really interesting to look back at those earlier days. Obviously, I came to London a little bit after that in the late 1990s, and there was some more activity. But I suppose the whole point is a lot of our services for domestic abuse were grown out of those early feminist efforts to try to address domestic abuse, but without a lot of help from systems. And so I think it is important to understand, why are we now at a point where we've just defined in the Domestic Abuse Act, domestic abuse as a definition, including children as victims in their own right, including the range of economic abuse, coercion and controlling behavior. I suppose to me, I would characterize it as a mixed picture, like lots of progress, excellent legislation, amazing work that has grown out of all of those efforts that I was describing earlier. But we shouldn't be surprised that we have never had our systems built to address domestic abuse, full stop. That's why, as employers, the need for the employer's initiative is so critical. But I would say the same in terms of the systemic changes that are needed throughout the whole of all of our systems: social care, housing, the criminal justice system, the family court, never ever built with that understanding of domestic abuse. So the systemic change is very critical. And at the same time, a lot of the ways that those changes have been led through people who've been working with victims and survivors for years and years. These are the very services that are right now on a funding cliff edge still. We had the Domestic Abuse Act, which helped with a duty for accommodation-based services, but we still have the vast majority of our domestic abuse services for the funding they get from government, which isn't obviously all of their funding. A lot of that is still on a cliff edge from year to year to year. So there's a lot we know. I often use this term, and it is very true. We need to shift from our good practice or the excellent practice we know of to make it common practice. And we are far from there yet. And I'm sure we'll talk about having violence against women and girls in a decade, and that is the kind of systemic change that will get us there, and really bedding down some of these chronic problems that we've had over the years. But that's not to say we haven't progressed and know a lot of what to do.
Yeah, well, that's such a great perspective to take us back over those 50 years. As Susan was saying, huge amount has been done, but even more yet to be done. So look, the government's come in. Jess, you've got this really fantastic new role. We know that you're a passionate supporter, champion, campaigner for improving the response to domestic abuse. And the government has set out a very ambitious agenda to significantly reduce people affected by domestic abuse. So we'd love to hear from you. What do you think needs to change, and what plans are emerging to enable you to make those changes? And particularly thinking about this audience, what if any role do you think there is for employers, any legislation that might be coming in that might affect them?
Yes, so I mean, Nicole is exactly right that what we need is a complete and utter systematic change. And so the government has committed to halving incidences of violence against women and girls in a decade. But and the idea, and so I can sit here as a Home Office Minister and talk very fluently about like literal policies that we would put in place that will help in policing or the criminal justice system more broadly. But that was very, very, very important, and looking at regimes of new orders. Most victims in the country, if you work with them and certainly are employing them, will have one of a range of orders, non-molestation orders, restraining. I've got a whole folder full of restraining orders. I don't like to put them near my children's birth certificates. It feels like they shouldn't be close. But that it doesn't actually deter any violence occurring against them or provide necessarily any sort of response really, or comfort. And so there's lots of things that we can be doing in the criminal and civil justice space. But even if we just did that alone, all we would be doing fundamentally is, once again, and Nicole is exactly right to take us back to the history. The reason why we have a social policy that is based on sticking plasters of when an incident has occurred is because it came from the victims movement. That all social policy has been driven by grassroots movements over the years, whether it's changes in forced marriage, whether it's changes in stalking. These things come from an individual or organisation going to somebody like me or another politician, and then laws changing in a sort of piecemeal way in reaction to a bad thing happening. And actually the sort of systematic approach of how we stop the bad thing happening in the first place, there wasn't in the mid-1970s a movement of perpetrators trying to stop that started an entire perpetrator movement or prevention movement or educational movement that would stop it. And so while there is a massive prevention piece that comes from giving victims the first time they ask the right service, I mean, that would be a start. But we have to look at trying to prevent this from happening. And actually employers and society at large hold an absolutely massive role in this, way, way, way more than the government, actually, in like people who are actually interacting with people every single day. Every single person in this room not just knows, but also loves a perpetrator of both rape and domestic abuse. The idea that we all now are willing to admit that we all know victims of this crime, post sort of Me Too, post that, actually almost every single one of you as an employer is currently employing a perpetrator of domestic abuse and or rape, if not both, if not multiple. And that, like, how we actually deal with those attitudes in society from education. So the government can tinker at that end. Tinker is massively to undersell what actually universal education, prevention education could potentially do if done well and not just as a checkbox for a load of kids in year 9. Oh my God, you got everything in year 9, didn't you? Condoms, drugs. It was just because it was the year you didn't have exams. So, like, you had to care about absolutely everything in year 9. It's like an overwhelming social justice year. But like actual evidence-based universal schools prevention programs. But that will help us in 20 years' time. There's millions of perpetrators currently existing in the system, and coming up with ways that we can together deter repeat incidences is going to be wildly important. And again, to the government's plans not just being about the criminal justice system is really important, because what Nicole says about the cliff edge for victims of domestic abuse services and sexual violence services is absolutely true. And as somebody who used to run one, we used to put all of our staff on notice it was always at Christmas time, which is a lovely time to put your staff on notice, because you were waiting for March to arrive. So that system needs to change. But why on earth is the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice funding mental health support? Why is it not systematically the expectation of every single health board, every single ICB or PCT or whatever it is we're going to call them this week? Why is it not a fundamental responsibility of every single part of our system that if you work with people, you work with perpetrators and you work with victims? Like, why is it that it will always be the case that there will be a cliff edge unless we mainstream it? And so the government is having a sort of mission approach where I expect Wes Streeting to be more important than me in the fight against violence against women and girls, not just coming to a meeting to check a box. Or I expect Bridget Phillipson to be more important than me in doing that, or how we deal with welfare, or, I mean, housing. Any victim of domestic violence will tell you that housing is the single biggest issue by a country mile. So we can't just legislate for better laws when that legislation leads to nothing changing on the ground.
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much. You've described, very wide cross-government response there. So I'm sure everybody here will, wish you the very best of luck with your colleagues and corralling them, and particularly with the budget coming
Rachel
up on
Reeves
the 30th
is the person I should have mentioned would be the most important.
to enable that to happen. But thinking about the people here today, employers, clearly hugely part of a system, if we're thinking about the whole UK and the whole national response. So coming back to you, Nicole, you've got a lot of experience and you spent a lot of time listening to people. So what would you share with this audience as the key things that employers can do in an effective response to domestic abuse experienced by their employees?
Well, I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the converted here. I really admire, admire the team at EIDA for this expansion over the last 5 years of having employers involved. And I would say, just going back to the earlier comments I made, we'll look back at some point and think, how were we not doing this all along? This is obvious, that given the prevalence of domestic abuse and the workforce and how much we're learning from some of the pathfinders, employers who've been at this for a while, and the benefits they're seeing. One of the most common things I hear from people whose employers are really showing leadership on this is how much they value the fact that their employer is making that clear. And yes, it's all about the detail, which EIDA is so well placed to help us with, which is, the how-to and the policies and some of the more complex issues, the perpetrators who are working, which are there, I agree, will be absolutely there in plain sight. But all of the things you can do. But I think really just the fact that you're showing that this is a workplace issue, that this is something that well-being issue for employees. I think making that very clear just sends a huge message to the whole of your teams and your employees, even the ones who don't specifically need that help, because they will know someone. And it is all about changing our attitudes and making much more normal the fact that this shouldn't be an add-on. This shouldn't be something that you could do if you have exceptional leadership in your organization. It must be something that all employers do. And I think that really turns the tide, as Jess said. I've spent years and years working in lots of domestic abuse services and initiatives, and then having, in this role, you have a very focused view of government and what what government is able to do. And I don't want to undersell that. I have very high expectations, as we all do, for this mission-driven, cross-departmental approach. But it is also true, you know, the here and the now, the people who have the greatest reach most quickly will be employers. It is it's the community, and the phrase I often use, coordinated community response. We have, you know, you are the community. People go to work, they talk to colleagues, they seek support, and there's so many things, you know, employee assistance programs, the kind of well-being, there's that thread. I often say there should be a really thick thread through every single part of government that will be looking and remembering and addressing domestic abuse. But it should be the same for everything you're doing as an employer as well, the kind of awareness raising, assistance. There's so many things. And that really, in my view, really does, from the victims and survivor perspective in particular, and also for perpetrators, obviously, who need opportunities to change and know that, you have the most immediate effect. You know, keep in mind it takes victims and survivors many years, often, before they may come across a specialist domestic abuse service or dare to tell a GP or anyone else. But they might be talking to their colleagues at work, or their things can be spotted at work. So it's that early intervention, which you can see a tremendous amount. I worked with a big housing provider years ago who found that they could, by just supporting both their tenants but also their employees, they were getting to people about a year earlier than our national data sets for specialist domestic abuse services. That is proof right there. You know, a year of ongoing abuse and coercion and control and harm. And so that is, you know, that should inspire you all and us all to make sure that we keep this, and we support EIDA to really bring the organizations together and help government, but help employees to get there. It's hugely important for the individual victim and survivor.
So, Nicole, you've drawn on a lot of your own experience there to give us some really good examples. In the room, we've got people here at the beginning of their journey that have yet to have a domestic abuse policy, yet to take action, but want to. They're here today. That's a great first start. So, Minister, you have seen a lot throughout your career as a politician and before of some really good examples. So what would you like employers in this room to do to really support?
I mean, the first thing I would say to any employer, I mean, obviously, being here and signing up to having the standards of the Employers Initiative is, like, I can't stress enough how the level of detail and knowledge we need. You and what Nicole says is absolutely right, is a specialist service has to exist, because when something is everybody's business, it actually becomes nobody's business. You need both. You don't need an enormous level of detail. You don't need to train yourself to be an independent domestic violence advisor, and organisations like this one, they're there to do that detailed work on employment policies and practices. But what I would say is that the funny thing is that people are terrified, employers are terrified of not knowing what to do in the case of a disclosure. And a disclosure isn't like somebody says, can I have a word with you? I need to sit down with you, and then sits in your office and says, my husband is beating me up. That isn't, I mean, people tell me that they've been raped while at the Tesco's checkout. People use different languages, and what I wouldn't worry about is not knowing what to do, because most victims and, in fact, perpetrators showing signs of behaviour, they do just want to have somebody to listen to them, and that you don't have to be like, I've got to call the police immediately, and I think a lot of people worry that if somebody comes forward and says, you know, like, I'm living with an abusive man and he beats me up every day, that you have to physically do something about it there and then. But actually, women and men who have suffered abuse are expert risk assessors, and so asking your employees what they What do you want me to do in this situation? Giving power back to that person is vitally important. So that's one thing I say, don't be too anxious about this actually happening in your workplaces. But I have seen some amazing practice. I mean, if I think of, it's funny because I was really raised not to love big banks and or accountancy firms. So it's been challenging on me at occasions. But some of the practice that we've seen in collaboration with the Employers Initiative and with Surviving Economic Abuse from banks in our country, what they're doing for their own employees, but also what that then leads to for their customer base has been, I mean, when the TSB started just giving £500 to people, I was literally like, I'm sorry, come again. Like, this is an amazing scheme. And the culture that I've seen set in because Lloyds, for example, initially started thinking about how to deal with their employees as an employer, employing lots of people, and what that then leads onto in the space for them as an institution in society. Have been remarkable, and actually there is something about how in the private sector the pace at which that moves is so much faster and greater than, you know, like you don't have to write around to every, oh my gosh, being in government, the amount of writing around to people that goes on.
There's a lot of letters.
Oh my gosh. And like, you know, there is something about the pace at which. And actually, in the case of the banks, what that led to then is government changing the way that we deal with, like, having flea funds and things. So there is, don't think you're in isolation. Don't think that you do well in your institution, that sits in a bubble. That changes things. It changes the world. That those institutions changed something and thought about their employees, then led on to thinking about their customers, then changed government policy, and then changed the lives of women much broader than the women who worked for them in that situation. Like, that's remarkable. And that happened in what, like a year and a half, 18 months? Like, that's... I wish I could make the government act that quickly.
I'm sure your predecessors would absolutely
agree
with you about
really,
this.
the encouragement just to get started is great to hear, because that is, with anything in my work that relates to domestic abuse, there's like getting through the front door of the A&E who's never maybe had anything, you know, before, or the registered social landlord. Like, if you're here and you have not had much exposure in your workplace to having a policy or doing this kind of work, don't be at all intimidated by the likes of hearing the very well developed kind of approaches, because every approach, every excellent example, including Lloyd's and others, would have started kind of quite incrementally. And I think the most encouraging thing is the moment you get started, you realize how important and how well the response is, and you'll see that kind of gradual feedback. It's just true. I can't think of any project in my entire working career where there wasn't enough of a response and people say, oh, actually, you wanted to do this, but we really don't need to do that here. Sadly, it's usually the opposite, you know. And so it's just getting started. And the great thing about the Employers Initiative, why I'm so supportive, is they're making it easier and easier for you, and bringing the best of this information together, which is tremendous.
If you think about the health and safety video that we watched when my husband is he has a manual job, and the same job his father had, and like most of the men in his family, and most of the people in the generation above him are missing fingers, and there's absolutely no way that my husband's generation and then my son's generation are exposed to the same risks at work that his father was. And so, like, my husband has a full complement of fingers, but his uncles don't, and that change happened in my husband's lifetime. That change happened in his working lifetime. And it comes not just from legislation that regulates and says you have to do this, because let's face it, if you work in the kind of field that we work in, the fact that it says that it's illegal to rape doesn't stop anybody. Laws in and of themselves don't actually stop things. It is how then employers adapted and took on that responsibility and changed the way that they thought it was appropriate for people like my husband to be working. And so, you know, he's not been wounded by his work. It's that we need the same sort of effort, because if you're working with people who are suffering this abuse. We need to take it on as if it is like, you know, a harmful material or a grinding machine. It's as dangerous to the victims that you are working with, if not more dangerous. Like, you could lose your life, not just your limbs.
Having said that, please remind your employers we have great legislation, and that and that we that there is, you know, we have a legal definition. Do we all know it? We have coercion and controlling behavior as an offense post separation due to the Domestic Abuse Act. There are legislative levers that I often think, you know, let's use them to our best effect. These are all things that we've got to remind people of as well as good levers. We have really, I often talk to people in other countries who struggle to define coercion and controlling behavior. So they don't have legislation that
we
does
have good
that,
legislation. It's just that then it needs to, actually get used.
So thinking about that culture change in the last 5 minutes together, and we've touched on this earlier, there are employers really thinking about perpetrators, really picking up on what you were saying there about people. Everybody here will have perpetrators in their workforce. So what would you like to see employers do in addressing and thinking about that issue?
I mean, one place I'd signpost you to out in the lobby is the Respect stand. I can see Joe Todd in the front row, and because they really have led the work on services that support people to change their behavior. But obvious things would be absolutely making sure that anyone is not using their workplace, you know, to be able to perpetrate further abuse, whether that's phone calls, interactions, using work time. There's so many of those obvious things. But one of the things I really am excited for the Employers Initiative to really help lead us is the naughty kind of employment issues. Those are more complex, and I appreciate that. But that's, again, why we need the support of the Employers Initiative to really help harness that. And I think Susan is obviously very well placed for that. But so there's easier things I think you can do that are proactive, and then it can get more complex, and we need to work together about that. But I think it's recognizing, as Jess said in the first instance, perpetrators are very often very likable. People in the workplace can be, you know, and are right in front of us in pretty high proportions, and may not obviously, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that goes without saying sometimes, but it's an obvious truth, but perpetrators of domestic abuse, you know, the characterization of kind of minimizing their behavior, denying their behavior, blaming their behavior on others, if you can kind of see that as a, you know, help understand that is the kind of day-to-day way that they will tend to, when confronted, think about domestic abuse and need that support to shift in their thinking.
So, Minister, how would you like to work with EIDA and the employers that we're working with who are working through these issues in the way that Nicole's involved with as well?
Actually, the truth is that we go 50 years ago in the women's movement, and the need to build the same level of infrastructure in change programs and intervention, whether that criminal justice or like actual change programs in the perpetrator space is upon us. Like that it has been the ignored issue, and so building that up is going to be wildly important. And at the moment, the truth is that we are at the sort of beginning of, like, I could sit here and tell you exactly what the very best practice to do if you had a victim working for you, and like a gold standard. I could sit here and tell you, and it would be evidence-based, and I'd know it'd work because I've done it a million times, both as an employer and as a support worker. But the same is not true of perpetration. Of what Nicole says about respect is absolutely. I wouldn't speak to literally anybody else about if you want expertise on perpetrators, but they are the absolute. They're the gold standard. So assume that. But what I would say is that we don't know, and actually we're not sure of the things that are going to, like, if you're coming across it, we don't currently necessarily know what the sort of employment tribunal cases might be, we're at the precipice, so it will be interesting, and actually we need to be thinking about how we deal with it. The one thing I would say, and this drives me absolutely mad, is that and in some of the more high-profile cases that have happened in policing, there's definitely been a dint of this, is that you don't have to prove to a criminal standard that somebody has abused somebody. We don't do that in any other area of employment law. We treat employment law as being the balance of probabilities. I'm going to take it on its merits. And I mean, not always done well. There's plenty of sexual harassment stories that could be told that would tell you otherwise. Don't think that if somebody is found not guilty in a criminal court, or nobody has even been to, well, she should go to the police or whatever. That is not the standard that you should be thinking about when dealing with your employees. There is a way of challenging the culture of entitlement and patriarchal norms in some cases that leads to people to perpetrate without having to, again, swoop in and rush to judgment. But we don't know there is no like brilliant system that we know about yet that has done this. So give it a whirl. Tell us how you went.
You know, we haven't been, dwelling on statistics, but only 1 in 6 victims and survivors will ever approach the police.
Yeah.
So that it's such a good point. One of the things I will say this because Jess is really a delight to see in government because of her knowledge, but also, we've talked about, you were asking what government can do. We did have over the last years, a fund that was allocated for development of perpetrator work, innovation. And Jess, I think, and we've talked about this, really wants to figure, we now need to say, what did we learn from that investment? What can we, be satisfied that we won't do much more of? But what are the things that, more importantly, that we will do more of? And I think that's a real opportunity in government, because it won't be just employers who struggle with trying to identify perpetrators. This is happening in core work in children's social care, core work in the family courts. Yeah. There's so many people who are struggling with how do I engage with, but also understand when there's lots of allegations, counter allegations, and so it's, in a way, it feels to be something that government can play quite a role in contributing to, in thinking, okay, next steps, what do we now invest in? And I think that's very exciting, because I think Jess has, obviously you could be making all the decisions, I hope, but you have the knowledge.
I will only if other people don't try hard enough.
But we have this great opportunity with the knowledge across government about this issue to kind of have that ambition. Yeah.
That's great, and we could carry on all morning, but I'm going to have to bring it to a conclusion on such a positive note. I'm sure we'll be wanting to collaborate, wanting to take this issue forward, hopefully be sat here in a year or two's time discussing about results. What works, what we've discussed, and showcasing real progress in that area. So thank you both very much indeed.